Welcome to Greyvale Echoes. Dive into chilling gothic horror, where haunted castles, ghostly secrets, and eerie relics unravel terrifying truths. Join us for spine-tingling tales of the unknown. Welcome back to Cursed Relics. Sometimes, the most terrifying artifacts don't just haunt a room. They demand a ritual at a place of power. Tonight, we follow a desperate man to a cursed river, where an ancient magic is about to awaken. The days that followed Robert Cairns' terrifying flight from Anthony Ferrara's study were a waking nightmare. The world of logic and reason, the comfortable, predictable world of a London physician, had been fractured, and he could find no way to piece it back together. He would walk the familiar, gaslit streets of the city, see the familiar faces of his patients, perform the familiar duties of his profession, but it was all a charade. He was a ghost haunting his own life, his mind perpetually trapped in that hot, smoky, incense-choked room, forever replaying the final, terrible moments of his encounter. He was a changed man. Sleep offered no escape. When he did manage to drift into an exhausted slumber, his dreams were haunted. He would find himself back in the ritual chamber, the hypnotic, guttural chanting from the phonograph an endless loop in his head. He would see the fiery opal at the heart of the seven-pointed star, its light pulsing like a malevolent heart. And most terrifyingly, he would hear the whisper. The dry, sibilant, and impossibly ancient female voice would snake its way into his dreams, speaking its unknown, powerful language, filling him with that same feeling of cold, arrogant rage and a chilling, possessive intimacy. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart hammering, the ghost of the whisper still echoing in the silent darkness of his own bedroom. During the day, it was a different kind of haunting. The memory of the amulet, and the force it contained, had become an obsession that rivaled Ferrara's own. The whisper of the Witch Queen had been more than just a sound. It had been a touch, a psychic wound that refused to heal. He felt marked. He felt as if a tiny, cold splinter of that ancient consciousness was lodged deep within his own, a silent observer that watched the world through his eyes. He would find himself looking at a patient and feeling a flash of cold, analytical disdain that was not his own. He would walk through a crowded market and feel a surge of immense, regal arrogance, a feeling of being a god amongst insects. These were fleeting, momentary feelings, but they terrified him. The encounter had not just been a frightening experience. It had been an infection, and he feared that if he did nothing, the infection would spread, and he would end up as mad and as consumed as Anthony Ferrara. This fear, the fear of his own sanity unraveling, was what finally galvanized him into action. He could not simply walk away. He could not pretend it hadn't happened. He was bound to this mystery now, not just by his loyalty to his friend, but by a desperate need for self-preservation. He had to find Ferrara. He had to understand what his friend had unleashed, and he had to find a way to stop it before it consumed them both. His hunt began where it had ended, at Ferrara's townhouse. He returned 2 days after his flight, this time in the cold, hard light of midday, armed with a renewed sense of purpose. He found the house just as he had left it, dark, silent, and unlocked. It was as if no one, not even a single servant, had dared to cross the threshold since the ritual had taken place. The house felt like a place under a quarantine of fear. With a grim resolve, he made his way back up the grand staircase to the forbidden chamber. The study door was still ajar. The air in the hallway was still tainted with the faint, sweet, and sickly smell of the incense. Steeling himself, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was a shock. The supernatural energy, the oppressive heat, the thick, choking smoke, it was all gone. The room was now cold, silent, and still. The fire in the brazier was dead, a pile of gray ash and the charred, black husks of the strange herbs. The phonograph was silent, its needle resting on the wax cylinder. The ghostly frescoes on the walls looked flat and lifeless in the daylight, like the crude, sad paintings of a deranged child. The room was no longer a temple. It was just a crime scene, a scene of a terrible spiritual crime. He walked to the center of the room, to the small, velvet-draped pedestal. His heart hammered in his chest as he looked down, half expecting, half dreading, to see the amulet still lying there. But it was gone. The black velvet was empty. Ferrara had been back. He had returned to his desecrated study to retrieve the source of his power, his cursed relic. And then he had vanished once more. Cairns' heart sank. He had hoped, foolishly, that Ferrara might have been scared by whatever had happened, that he might have abandoned his mad quest. But the absence of the amulet proved the opposite. This was not the end. The events in this room had not been a failure. They had been a success, preparation, and Ferrara, armed with his terrible artifact, had now moved on to the next, and presumably final, stage of his plan. A desperate search began. If Ferrara was gone, he must have left some clue, some indication of where he was going, of what he intended to do next. Cairn began to sift through the chaotic mess of the room, his movements now frantic. He looked for anything. A railway ticket, a hastily scribbled address, a letter from a colleague. He searched through the scattered books, shaking their pages, hoping a stray note might fall out. He rummaged through the pockets of a coat that had been discarded on a chair. He found nothing but dust, sand, and more of Ferrara's increasingly unhinged-looking notes on ancient rituals and forgotten gods. He felt a growing sense of hopelessness. Ferrara had vanished without a trace, taking his terrible secret with him. But Cairn, a man trained in diagnosis, knew that one must always look for the hidden symptoms, the clues that are not in plain sight. He forced himself to be methodical. He began to go through the stacks of paper on what was left of Ferrara's desk, not just looking for a single clue, but trying to understand the pattern of his friend's madness. Most of the papers were translations, complex analyses of obscure passages from the Book of the Dead, or detailed astronomical charts aligning the Egyptian constellations with specific dates and times. It was the work of a genius, but a genius who had lost all perspective. Then, tucked away at the bottom of a heavy stack of books on funerary rites, he found it. Cryptic clue. It was not a letter or a formal note. It was a fragment of a much older, more brittle piece of parchment. It was a map. Cairn recognized the style immediately. It was a hand-drawn map of Oxford, the city of dreaming spires, where both he and Ferrara had spent their university days. But the map was focused on a specific, and rather obscure part of the city. It showed the winding path of the river Isis, and it highlighted a particular, secluded bend in the river, a place far from the bustling boathouses and the well-trod towpaths. It was a lonely, marshy area, known for its thick fogs and treacherous banks. And on this spot on the map, Ferrara had drawn a single symbol in dark, black ink. It was not a simple X. It was an ancient Egyptian hieroglyph. Cairn, thanks to his long and often tedious evenings spent listening to Ferrara's passionate lectures, recognized it instantly. It was the symbol for a Seba. In its most common translation, it meant star or teaching. But in the more obscure, mystical texts that Ferrara had been so obsessed with, it had another, more potent meaning. It meant gateway, portal, a place of transition between the world of the living and the world of the dead. A cold dread, colder than any he had felt in this room, washed over him. This was not just a location. It was a destination, a place of power, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. And as he looked closer at the map fragment, he saw a final, terrible detail. In the corner, scrawled in Ferrara's jagged, urgent hand, was a date and a time. The date was today's, and the time was the stroke of midnight. The race against time had begun. The ritual in the study, the activation of the amulet, it was all just a prelude. The main event, the true purpose of Ferrara's dark work, was to take place tonight, at a gateway, at midnight. He was not just trying to study magic anymore. He was trying to open a door. And Cairn had no doubt that what lay on the other side of that door was something that should never, ever be allowed to enter the world of men. He felt the surge of adrenaline, the cold fear replaced by a hot, fierce urgency. He had to get to Oxford. He had to get to that spot on the river. He didn't know what he would do when he got there. He was one man, a doctor armed with nothing but a medical bag and a terrifying, half-understood secret, against a sorcerer who was about to command the power of an ancient and malevolent queen. But he knew he had to try. He was the only one who knew. He was the only one who could possibly intervene. His journey into shadow began. He left the cold, dead study, closing the door firmly behind him, leaving the ghosts to their silence. He rushed from the house and into the bustling London streets, his mind already miles away. The journey to Oxford, normally a pleasant, leisurely trip by train, was now a frantic, desperate race against a supernatural clock. Every delay, every stop, was a fresh torment. He sat in the train carriage, the English countryside rolling past the window, but he did not see it. He saw only the glowing hieroglyphs on the amulet, and the terrible, empty eyes of the gods in Ferrara's frescoes. And as he traveled, he felt a new and unnerving sensation. He felt as if he were being watched. It was a strange, paranoid feeling, but it was persistent. He would catch a glimpse of a face in the crowd at a station, a face that seemed to be looking at him with an unnatural intensity, only for it to be gone when he looked again. He would feel a sudden cold draft in the warm train car, and the faint, familiar scent of that strange, sweet incense. He was being followed. The shadowy conspiracy was not confined to Ferrara's house. It had agents, or at least its influence was spreading. Perhaps the Witch Queen, now awakened, could extend her senses through the amulet. and she was now tracking the man who had dared to touch her and then flee. Or perhaps there were other human agents at work, a secret society, a cult built around the worship of the Queen, and they were monitoring him, ensuring that no one interfered with their master's great work. He arrived in Oxford as dusk was falling. The city, with its ancient honey-colored stone colleges and its air of scholarly peace, should have been a comfort. But to Cairn it now looked like a stage for a horror story. The dreaming spires looked like the jagged teeth of a great, stone monster. The quiet, winding lanes felt like the pathways of a labyrinth. He was a man walking into the heart of his enemy's territory. He did not go to his old college, he did not seek out any old friends. He was on a secret, desperate mission. He found a small, discreet inn, and there he waited, watching the clock on the mantelpiece, its slow, ticking hands measuring out the final hours until midnight, until the final confrontation at the cursed river. The hunt was almost over. The horror was about to begin. The hours leading up to midnight were the longest of Robert Cairn's life. He sat in the small, anonymous room of the Oxford Inn, the frantic energy of his journey slowly congealing into a cold, heavy dread. The ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece was a merciless, rhythmic hammer, each tick a step closer to the appointed hour, a step closer to a confrontation he was terrifyingly ill-equipped to face. He was a man of science, a man who dealt in the predictable and the provable. He was about to walk into a world governed by a different, and far more ancient set of laws. He felt like a soldier being sent into battle armed with a textbook on anatomy while his enemy wielded cannons. As the hour grew late, he left the inn. He walked through the quiet, sleeping streets of Oxford. The ancient colleges, with their magnificent spires and their centuries of accumulated knowledge, seemed to look down on him with a kind of sad, stony indifference. They were bastions of logic and reason, but the magic his friend Ferrara was meddling with was older than their oldest foundations, a primal force that did not care for human logic. Cairn felt utterly alone, a single, rational man walking towards a battle for the soul of his friend, and perhaps, for the soul of the world itself. His destination, the secluded bend in the river Isis marked on Ferrara's map, was a good 2 miles from the center of the city. He left the well-lit, cobbled streets behind and set out on a dark country lane that led down towards the river meadows. The air grew colder, damper. The neat, orderly world of the city gave way to the wild, untamed darkness of the countryside. And as he drew closer to the river, the atmosphere began to change in a way that was both subtle and deeply, profoundly unnatural. The first sign was the fog. It was not the usual soft, gray mist that often rose from the river on a cool night. This was a wall of fog. It rolled in from the direction of the river with a silent, predatory speed, a thick, white, and clinging vapor that swallowed the landscape whole. One moment, he could see the dark shapes of the trees and the faint, silvery gleam of the river in the distance under the moonlight. The next, his world had been reduced to a tiny, claustrophobic circle of visibility, no more than a few feet in any direction. The fog was so dense it was like walking through wet cotton. It muffled all sound, creating a strange, dead silence that was broken only by the sound of his own, suddenly very loud, breathing and the soft, damp squelch of his boots on the muddy path. And it was a strange, intelligent-feeling fog. It didn't drift or swirl naturally. It seemed to cling to him, to coil around him, its damp, ghostly tendrils cold against his skin. It felt like a living barrier, a shroud that had been deliberately placed over this part of the river to conceal what was happening within it. It was a supernatural boundary, and he had just crossed it. He felt a sense of immense isolation, as if he had stepped out of the world he knew and into a pocket dimension, a small, gray, silent world where the only thing that existed was him, the path, and a terrible, unseen purpose that lay ahead. He pressed on, his hand outstretched in front of him, feeling his way through the disorienting whiteout. He was guided only by the faint, downward slope of the path and the growing sound of the river. But the sound of the river was wrong. He knew this stretch of the Isis from his university days. He remembered it as a gentle, placid river, its water flowing with a cheerful, chuckling sound as it passed over the smooth stones of its bed. But the sound he was hearing now was not the sound he remembered. As he drew closer, the sound that reached him through the thick, muffling fog was a heavy, sluggish, and almost oily lapping. Lap slosh, it was the sound of a thick, viscous liquid, not of clean, flowing water. It sounded as if the river itself had grown old and tired, its current slowed, its water heavy with some unseen burden. And beneath that sluggish, lapping sound, there was something else, a new sound that made the hair on his arms stand on end. It was a faint, almost inaudible, low-frequency humming. It was not a mechanical sound, felt ancient, organic. It seemed to be coming from the water itself, a deep, resonant vibration that he felt more in the soles of his feet and in his teeth than he heard with his ears. It was a sound of immense, dormant power, the hum of a great, sleeping leviathan lying in the muddy depths. The river was not just a body of water anymore. It was a charged, living entity. It was awake, and it was humming a song of terrible, ancient magic. Now, a new scent began to cut through the clean, damp smell of the fog, and it was a scent he recognized with a jolt of pure, visceral terror. It was the smell from Ferrara's study, the thick, cloying, and sweet perfume of the exotic incense, the kifi. The lotus was here, clinging to the mist, seemingly rising from the humming water itself. But here, in the open air, mixed with the natural smells of the riverbank, it was even more unsettling. The sacred, magical scent was interwoven with the rich, pungent smell of damp, decaying earth and the sickly, sweet stench of rotting vegetation from the marshy banks. The combination was nauseating, a perfume of life and death, of magic and decay. It was as if Ferrara had not just brought his incense here. It was as if the river itself, this entire cursed setting, was naturally exuding the scent. As if this place, this gateway, was so saturated with ancient, magical energy that the very soil and water were imbued with its unholy perfume. The magic had not just been brought to this place. It was an intrinsic part of it. This was a place that had been waiting for Ferrara. It had been waiting for the amulet. It had been waiting for this night. And then, the final element of the oppressive atmosphere made its presence known. The distant storm, the one he had been half aware of for the past hour, began to make its approach. The faint, muffled rumbles of thunder in the distance grew louder, more defined. They were no longer just a background noise. They were becoming a slow, ominous, and deliberate drumbeat. Each peal of thunder was a punctuation mark in the humming song of the river, a celestial countdown to the midnight hour. The flashes of lightning were still miles away, silent, sheet lightning that would illuminate the thick wall of fog from within for a split second, turning the entire world into a brief, ghostly whiteout before plunging it back into gray darkness. The storm was not a random meteorological event. Cairn felt, with a certainty that was now beyond doubt, that it was connected to the ritual. It was being drawn here, a gathering of natural elemental power to feed the supernatural event that was about to take place. The fog, the humming water, the magical scent. The approaching storm, it was a perfectly constructed theatrical stage for a performance of the most terrible and ancient magic. This was not just a riverbank. It was a temple, and the ritual was about to begin. Cairn finally reached the edge of the river. The path opened up onto a small, muddy clearing, and he could see the dark, sluggish water lapping at the bank just a few feet in front of him. The fog was so thick here that he could not see the opposite bank, or even more than 20 feet in either direction. He was in a small, isolated, gray, and humming pocket of the world. He crouched down behind a large, gnarled willow tree at the edge of the clearing, its long, weeping branches providing a thin, spectral curtain through which to watch. He checked his pocket watch. The hands were glowing faintly. It was 5 minutes to midnight. He had made it. But what now? He was a single man, hidden in the fog, about to witness a ritual that was commanding the very elements of nature. He was hopelessly, terrifyingly outmatched. All he could do was watch, and wait, and pray that he would find some opportunity, some moment of weakness to intervene, to pull his friend back from the brink of an abyss from which there could be no return. He hunkered down, the damp cold of the earth seeping into his clothes, and he watched the humming, waiting water, his heart keeping a frantic, terrified time with the slow, approaching drumbeat of the thunder. The cursed banks of the Isis were ready. The stage was set, and the sorcerer was about to make his entrance. Crouched behind the gnarled, weeping willow, Robert Cairn was a ghost at a demon's coronation. The world had shrunk to this one small, fog-shrouded clearing on the banks of a humming, malevolent river. The air was electric, thick with a tension so profound it was almost a physical force. Every nerve in his body was screaming, a high-pitched symphony of terror and adrenaline. The clock in his mind ticked down the final, agonizing minutes to midnight, each second a heavy, leaden weight. He was a man of science, a man of logic, but the overwhelming, coordinated strangeness of this place had battered his skepticism into submission. He no longer questioned whether what he was seeing was real. He only questioned whether he would survive it. It was through a thin, parting veil of the swirling mist that he saw the first sign of his friend's arrival. A light. It was a faint, flickering, and deeply familiar light, appearing suddenly in the center of the clearing at the water's edge. It was the reddish-orange glow of the bronze brazier from Ferrara's study. Cairn hadn't seen him arrive. One moment the clearing was empty, the next, the brazier was there, its coals already glowing, as if it had been teleported directly from the London townhouse to this cursed riverbank. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of dread through Cairn. It was a symbol of his friend's madness, a portable altar for his dark and terrible god. And then, Ferrara himself stepped into the dim circle of light. He seemed to emerge from the fog itself, a tall, dark silhouette against the ruddy glow of the fire. He was no longer the man Cairn knew. The familiar, tweed-clad scholar was gone, replaced by a figure that was both regal and terrifying. Ferrara was draped in a long, black, hooded robe, its fabric seeming to absorb the light. His face, visible in the flickering glow, was pale, gaunt, and etched with lines of ecstatic exhaustion. But it was his eyes that were the most changed. They were wide, dark, and burned with a feverish, obsessive fire. The eyes of a zealot, a prophet who is looking not at the world in front of him, but at the world he is trying to summon into being. Ferrara moved with a slow, deliberate, and theatrical grace. He was no longer a simple man. He was a high priest, performing the most sacred and terrible ceremony of his faith. He moved to the very edge of the riverbank, so close that the sluggish, dark water was lapping at the toes of his boots. He stood facing the humming river, his back to Cairn, a solitary figure communing with the ancient power that resided there. And then, he began his invocation. The sound that emerged from Ferrara's throat was the one that had haunted Cairn's dreams. It was the same ancient, guttural language he had heard from the phonograph, but hearing it spoken by his own friend, by a living, breathing human throat, was infinitely more disturbing. The words were a low, powerful, and monotonous chant, a series of harsh consonants and long, drawn-out vowels that seemed to be the native language of the rocks and the river and the storm itself. He spoke not with the hesitant, academic tone of a scholar translating a text, but with the absolute authority of a man speaking his mother tongue. The words flowed from him, a dark, hypnotic river of sound that poured into the misty air. And as he chanted, he raised his hand. And in his hand he held the cursed relic, the amulet of the Witch Queen. Even from his hiding place, Cairn could see it glowing. The milky white, seven-pointed star seemed to pulse with a sickly, internal light, and the fiery opal at its center burned with a malevolent, watchful intelligence. It was feeding on the energy of the place, on the power of Ferrara's invocation. With every chanted word, the amulet seemed to grow brighter, its light a cold, dead green that stood in stark, unnatural contrast to the warm, red glow of the brazier. Ferrara was not just holding the amulet. He was using it as a focal point, a lens to concentrate his will and the power of his words, and to project them into the humming, waiting river. It was then that the true, undeniable magic began, a phenomenon so impossible, so contrary to all the known laws of nature, that Cairn felt his rational mind begin to crack under the strain. As Ferrara's chanting grew louder, more intense, the surface of the dark river began to react. The water itself began to glow. It was not a reflection of the brazier or the amulet. This was a light that was being born from within the water itself. Faint, ethereal, and ghostly lines of a pale, blue light began to appear on the surface of the black, sluggish river. They started as small, hesitant traceries, but as Ferrara's incantation reached a fever pitch, they grew in brightness and complexity. They swirled and coiled, forming intricate, geometric patterns, interlocking circles and sharp, angular lines. It was as if an invisible, ghostly hand were drawing with a brush of pure, liquid light upon a canvas of black water. Cairn stared, mesmerized by the terrible, beautiful sight. The glowing patterns were not random. They were symbols, glyphs, but they were not the familiar hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt. They were more complex, more arcane, a form of magical writing that was both elegant and deeply menacing. The glowing symbols spread outwards from the spot directly in front of Ferrara, forming a vast, intricate, and slowly rotating magical circle upon the surface of the river. The circle was at least 30 feet in diameter, a huge, shimmering blue sigil of immense power, its light pulsing in time with Ferrara's chanting. The supernatural horror of the scene was now complete. Ferrara was not just performing a ritual on the riverbank. He was using the river itself as his magical parchment. He was writing his summons upon the very skin of the water. The gateway, the Seba, was being drawn. The door was being unlocked. And as the glowing glyphs reached their full, terrible brightness, the power in the clearing began to build to a terrifying crescendo. Cairn could feel it as a physical force, a pressure against his skin, a deep, vibrating hum that seemed to be making the very air tremble. The low humming from the river, which had been a constant, background drone, now rose in pitch and volume, becoming a powerful, resonant roar that seemed to be coming from the very depths of the earth. The ground beneath him, which had been solid, began to vibrate, a low, steady tremor that shook the roots of the willow tree he was hiding behind. The distant storm, as if in answer to the summons of power, surged forward. The rumbles of thunder were no longer distant. They were now directly overhead, great, cracking explosions of sound that seemed to tear the sky apart. The silent, sheet lightning was replaced by jagged, forked bolts that stabbed down into the river meadows around them, each flash illuminating the swirling, foggy scene in a series of stark, terrifying, black and white tableaus. In one flash, he would see Ferrara, his arms outstretched, his head thrown back in ecstatic communion with the storm. In the next, he would see the horrifying, alien beauty of the glowing blue circle on the water. The air was so thick with power now that it was almost impossible to breathe. It was a maelstrom of conflicting energies: the heat from the brazier, the cold from the river, the static charge from the storm, the magical power from the ritual. It was a scene from a primal creation myth, the world being unmade and remade according to a new and terrible set of rules. Cairn felt like a tiny, insignificant insect caught in the heart of a cosmic engine, and he was about to be crushed by its gears. He was witnessing a paranormal event of the highest order, a direct and successful manipulation of the forces of nature by a human will, amplified by a cursed relic. The supernatural horror was no longer a matter of whispers and feelings. It was a raw, elemental, and overwhelming reality, and it was rapidly approaching its peak. The world had become a symphony of chaos, and Antony Ferrara was its conductor. He stood at the edge of the river, a figure of terrible, triumphant power, orchestrating the storm, the humming river, and the glowing, magical sigil on the water with the words of his ancient, unholy chant. Robert Cairn, hidden behind the weeping willow, was a prisoner of the spectacle. He was no longer thinking, no longer reasoning. He was simply a vessel for pure, undiluted terror, his mind overwhelmed by the sheer, elemental power of the ritual he was witnessing. The air was so thick with energy it felt like he was breathing lightning. The ground trembled beneath him. The world was being unmade. And then, through the cacophony of the thunder and the roaring hum of the river, a new sound began to toll. It was the sound of a distant church bell, its deep, bronze notes somehow cutting through the chaos with a clear, cold finality. It was the sound of the world of men, the world of order and time, making one last futile protest. The bell began to toll the hour of midnight. Bong! The first stroke of midnight seemed to be a signal. The climax had arrived. As the sound of the bell echoed across the water, Ferrara's chanting, which had been a low, monotonous drone, rose in pitch and volume. His voice took on a new, ecstatic, and terrifying power. He threw his head back, his face, illuminated by the flashes of lightning, a mask of pure, fanatical zeal. And he raised the amulet of the Witch Queen high above his head with both hands. The amulet, which had been glowing with a sickly green light, now blazed with a new and brilliant intensity. It was no longer just glowing. It was radiating light, a cold, white, and powerful beam that shot up into the stormy, black sky like a reverse lightning strike. Bong! The second stroke of the midnight bell. Ferrara's body went rigid. He was a conduit, a channel for the immense power that was flowing through the amulet. He screamed out a final, powerful word of invocation. It was not a word from his previous chanting. It was a single, sharp, and commanding name, a name that seemed to hold all the power of the ritual within it. The name was ancient, alien, and full of a terrible, regal authority. It was the name of the thing he was summoning. Bong! The third stroke, and in response to that final, screamed name, the river answered. The great, glowing blue circle of glyphs on the surface of the water, which had been swirling with a slow, hypnotic grace, suddenly flashed with a blinding blue-white light. The humming sound that had been rising from the depths now became a deafening, physical roar, a sound of immense pressure being released. And the center of the magical circle, the very heart of the glowing sigil, began to move. The water erupted, but it was not a splash. It was not a geyser. It was a slow, silent, and utterly unnatural bulging. The surface of the river in the center of the circle swelled upwards, as if a great, unseen sphere were rising from the depths beneath it. The water formed a smooth, dark, and perfectly hemispherical mound, a dome of black, glassy water that rose higher and higher, defying all the laws of physics and fluid dynamics. It was the river itself being given a new and terrible form, a living tumor growing from its surface. The sight was so profoundly, fundamentally wrong that Cairn felt a wave of nausea and vertigo wash over him. He was witnessing a violation of the very fabric of reality. The mound of water rose to a height of perhaps 6 or 7 feet, a silent, black dome in the center of the blazing blue circle, and then it stopped. It held its impossible shape, the water churning and coiling over its surface. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to be frozen in this single, impossible tableau. The screaming sorcerer on the bank, the blazing amulet, the raging storm, and the impossible, silent dome of black water. And then, from the very peak of that watery mound, something began to emerge. It pushed through the surface of the black water with a slow, deliberate, and unstoppable force. It was not a head. It was not a body. It was a hand. It was a pale, slender, and unnaturally long hand, the color of bleached bone or old ivory. It seemed to be woven from the thick river fog and the cold, ghostly moonlight, a thing of mist and shadow given a terrifyingly solid form. The fingers were long, graceful, and tapering, with nails that were perfectly shaped but had the faint, bluish tinge of poor circulation, or of death. It was not a monstrous, clawed hand. In fact, it was a hand of an almost unearthly regal elegance. And this elegance, this terrible, cold beauty, somehow made it even more horrifying. This was not the hand of a beast. This was the hand of a monarch, the hand of a queen. The ghostly, pale hand rose from the water, its wrist as slender as a young woman's. The black, oily water of the cursed river streamed from its ghostly form, but the hand itself was not wet. It seemed to repel the water, to exist in a space that was separate from the physical world. It rose higher and higher, attached to a long, slender arm that was also made of the same pale, misty substance, until it was held aloft, poised in the churning electric air, a single, terrible, and silent statement of arrival. The apparition was here. The thing Ferrara had been summoning, the entity from beyond the gateway, had answered his call. It had reached through the veil between worlds and had laid its hand upon the shores of reality. Ferrara fell to his knees on the riverbank, his body trembling, the light from the amulet dimming. His work was done. He was no longer the master of the ritual. He was now its supplicant, kneeling before the terrible power he had unleashed. The hand, which had been held aloft, fingers slightly curled, now began to move. It moved with a slow, deliberate, and intelligent grace. It was not a random movement. It was a gesture. The hand turned in the air, its palm facing downwards. The long, elegant fingers slowly, purposefully, uncurled. And then the long, slender index finger extended, straightening until it was a single, pale, and accusatory line. The hand, and its pointing finger, now hung in the air, a silent, ghostly signpost. And Cairn, cowering behind the willow tree, his heart a frozen lump of ice in his chest, felt a new and even more profound wave of terror wash over him, because he knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching, and soul-shattering certainty, where that finger was about to point. He had been seen. The entity knew he was there. The ghostly hand turned slowly, majestically, in the air. It did not point at the kneeling, supplicant form of Antony Ferrara. It did not point up at the raging, stormy sky. It did not point down at the glowing, magical sigil on the water. It swept past all of them, its movement as smooth and as certain as the hand of a clock. And it pointed directly through the swirling, gray fog. It pointed directly past the trunk of the gnarled willow tree. It pointed directly at the hiding place of Robert Cairn. The world stopped. The thunder, the chanting, the humming of the river, it all faded into a distant, buzzing roar. The only thing that existed for Cairn was that pale, elegant, and terrible finger, leveled directly at him. It was a silent, damning accusation. It was a summons. It was an invitation. It was a death sentence. He was no longer a witness. He was no longer an intruder. He had been seen by a being from another dimension, a being of unimaginable power and antiquity. And he had been acknowledged. He was now a part of the ritual, participant. Perhaps, he thought with a final, mind-breaking surge of horror, he was the intended sacrifice. The ghostly finger remained, steady and unwavering, a pale dagger aimed at his heart. The chilling encounter had reached its horrifying peak. He had followed his friend into the darkness, and he had found not just a sorcerer, but the god the sorcerer worshipped. And that god was now looking directly at him. He had sought to solve a mystery, and he had, in doing so, become the central part of it. The hand from the river had risen, and it had chosen him. He was trapped, marked, and utterly, completely, and hopelessly, alone with the supernatural horror that he and his friend had unleashed upon the world. Time for Robert Cairn had ceased to exist. He was a man impaled on a single, eternal moment. The ghostly, pale finger, pointing at him from across the misty clearing, was the only thing in the universe. It was the focal point of all the chaotic energy, the final, terrible destination of the night's dark journey. The roaring storm, the kneeling form of his friend Ferrara, the glowing sigil on the water, it all faded into a peripheral, meaningless blur. There was only the accuser and the accused, the summoner and the summoned, and he somehow was now both. His mind, which had been battered by a relentless storm of supernatural phenomena, finally fractured. It broke free from the moorings of terror and drifted into a strange, detached state of hyperanalytical calm. He was no longer just feeling the fear. He was observing it. He was a physician diagnosing his own terminal condition. And in this strange, clinical state of mind, the full, terrifying implications of what he had just witnessed began to unfold, layer by horrifying layer. The first, and most immediate, conclusion was a testament to the power of the entity Ferrara had summoned. The hand's deliberate, intelligent action was undeniable proof. This was not some mindless, elemental force that had been stirred from its slumber. This was not a chaotic demon, dragged unwillingly into the world. This was a conscious entity, an intelligence, a being that was not just powerful but aware. It possessed senses that transcended the physical. The thick, swirling wall of fog, the dark of the night, the physical barrier of the willow tree, none of it had mattered. The entity had not seen him with eyes. It had perceived him. It had felt his presence, his fear, his very consciousness, as clearly as if he had been standing next to Ferrara in the center of the clearing. The shadowy conspiracy he had feared was not just a human one. It was a cosmic one, and its chief agent had senses that were godlike in their scope. This realization immediately redefined Cairn's role in the night's terrible drama. He had come here as a pursuer, a hunter, tracking his friend in a desperate attempt to stop him. He had then become a witness, a secret observer hiding in the shadows, watching a forbidden ritual unfold. But now, with the pointing of that spectral finger, his status had changed once more. He was no longer a secret. He had been seen. He had been acknowledged. And in being acknowledged, he had been pulled from the audience and thrown onto the stage. He was now a part of the ritual. The ghostly hand, hanging in the air, its finger leveled at his heart, was both an accusation and an invitation. It was an accusation that screamed, "I see you, intruder. I see you, spy. You are not welcome here, and yet you are here." But it was also an invitation, a summons that whispered, "You have witnessed my arrival. You have felt my power. Now come, step out of the shadows. Your part in this is not yet over." He was caught, trapped not by any physical chain, but by the unbreakable bond of a supernatural being's focused attention. He could no longer flee. To run now would be like a mouse trying to outrun the gaze of an eagle. He was pinned to his spot, not by fear, but by the sheer, overwhelming weight of a god's notice. And this led him to the central, terrible, and unanswered question of the night. The core of the chilling mystery that had brought him to this cursed riverbank. What was Ferrara's true goal? What or who was he truly trying to summon, and for what purpose? Cairn's initial assumption had been that Ferrara, in his madness, was attempting to summon the Witch Queen herself, to bring her forth physically from whatever netherworld she inhabited. But the appearance of the single, disembodied hand suggested something different, something perhaps more subtle and more sinister. Was this just the first part of the entity? A hand reaching through a newly opened gateway, to be followed by an arm, a shoulder, a body? Or was the hand the entity itself, a symbolic manifestation of its power, a representative sent to the mortal plane? Perhaps Ferrara's goal was not a full-scale summoning. Perhaps he was simply trying to open a line of communication, to ask a question of this ancient, all-knowing being. The ritual, then, would be a kind of cosmic telephone call, and the hand was the sign that the call had been answered. But what question could be so important that it would require such a dangerous and reality-bending ritual? Was he seeking knowledge? The location of a lost tomb? The secret to eternal life? The true names of the gods? Or was it something more personal? Was he seeking power? The power to command the elements, to curse his enemies, to rewrite his own destiny? The hand, in this context, might be the instrument of that power, a spectral servant now waiting for its new master's command. But then, a darker thought occurred to Cairn. What if Ferrara was not the master at all? He had kneeled, after all. He was a supplicant. What if the ritual was not about Ferrara summoning the queen, but about the queen summoning Ferrara? What if this was a final initiation, a test of loyalty, and Ferrara's reward was not to command the power, but to be taken by it? To be pulled into the queen's world, to serve her in her own shadowy, timeless realm for all eternity. The pointing finger, then, might not have been for Cairn at all. It might have been a command to Ferrara. Bring me the witness. The sacrifice is not yet complete. The thought sent a jolt of pure ice through his veins. And this raised a new, and deeply troubling question about the setting itself. Was the river itself cursed? The humming sound from the water, the strange, sluggish quality of its flow, the ancient, magical scent that seemed to rise from its banks, it all suggested that this place was a source of power in its own right. Was this a place that had always been a gateway, a natural weak spot between worlds, a place that ancient sorcerers had used for millennia? Had Ferrara, through his obsessive research of ancient manuscripts, simply rediscovered a lost place of power? If so, the river itself was a cursed setting, a permanent, geographical wound on the face of the earth, and Ferrara had just reopened it. Or was it the other way around? Was the river, until tonight, just a normal, placid river? Had Ferrara brought the curse here with him? Had the power of the amulet, the vessel of the Witch Queen's soul, been so immense that it had tainted the very land and water around it? Had he transformed this ordinary riverbank into a temporary temple, a magical circle that would fade with the morning light? The first possibility was more terrifying on a cosmic scale, suggesting that such gateways exist all over the world, silent and waiting. But the second possibility was more terrifying on a personal scale. It meant that the power of the amulet was so great that it could warp reality around it, that its wielder could create a haunted setting wherever they chose. It meant that the curse was portable, and it was now in the hands of a madman. These were the thoughts that raced through Cairn's fractured mind as he remained frozen behind the tree, pinned by the gaze of the spectral hand. He did not know how long he was there. Time had become a meaningless concept. Could have been a second. Could have been an hour. But eventually the tableau was broken. With a slowness that was agonizing to watch, the ghostly hand began to retract. It did not vanish. It pulled back, its long, elegant fingers curling into a soft fist, and it began to sink back into the dome of black water from which it had emerged. The mound of water itself began to recede, the river's surface slowly sinking back to its normal level. The brilliant, blue, glowing glyphs on the water began to fade, their light dimming until they were gone. The roaring hum from the depths quieted, returning to a low, almost imperceptible thrum. The thunder, its dramatic purpose served, began to roll away into the distance. The ritual was over. The gateway was closing. Ferrara, still kneeling on the bank, let out a long, shuddering sigh, his body slumping as if the strings holding him up had been cut. He remained there for a moment, a spent and empty vessel, before slowly, stiffly, rising to his feet. He did not look back at the river. He did not look towards Cairn's hiding place. He simply wrapped his black robe tightly around himself, picked up the brazier, which was now just a cold metal bowl, and with the glowing amulet still clutched in his other hand, he turned and melted back into the thick, clinging fog. He was gone. Cairn remained where he was, his body trembling uncontrollably, the adrenaline leaving him feeling weak and sick. He was alone. The fog was beginning to thin as the storm passed completely, and the first, faint, gray light of a new dawn was beginning to touch the sky. The river was just a river again, its water black and still. The air was just cold and damp. The world was returning to normal. But it was a new kind of normal, a normal where he knew, with absolute certainty, that the world of men was just a thin, fragile crust over a much older, darker, and more powerful reality. He had seen beyond the veil. He had been seen by what lay beyond the veil, and he was left with a universe of unanswered questions. What had Ferrara accomplished? Had the ritual been a success? Had he gotten the knowledge or the power he had sought? Or had he simply awakened something he could never hope to control? And what of the hand? Why had it pointed at him? Was it a threat? Promise? A summons he was now fated to answer at some future, terrible time? The chilling mystery had not been solved. It had merely been demonstrated. He had found his friend, only to lose him to a power so immense it defied comprehension. And he, Robert Cairn, a man of science, was now a keeper of a terrible supernatural secret, a secret that he knew would haunt him for the rest of his life. The unsolved summons hung in the cold morning air, a question with no answer, a promise of horrors yet to come. The ghostly hand hangs in the air, a silent, damning accusation. Cairn has found his friend, only to witness him summoning a supernatural horror from the depths. The ritual's purpose is unknown, but Cairn has now been marked. What or who is Ferrara truly summoning from that cursed river? And after being discovered, what will the entity do next? Let me know your theories about this terrifying ritual. Thanks for braving the shadows with Gravevale Echoes. What creepy secret haunts you? Subscribe, share your fears, and return for more gothic chills from the unseen world.